August the 2nd, 1943, 2:27 in the morning. Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. The Pacific Ocean is black as ink. No moon, no stars. Just darkness so complete that Lieutenant John F. Kennedy can barely see his own hand in front of his face. 13 men are scattered across the deck of PT-109, their eyes straining against the void. The engines are throttled down to a whisper, a single cylinder each, because the Japanese have listening devices that can pick up the roar of Packard engines from miles away. They're hunting destroyers tonight. 4 of them, somewhere in this darkness, carrying 900 soldiers and enough supplies to turn the tide of the entire Solomons campaign. Kennedy stands at the helm, his back aching from the injury that should have kept him out of the war entirely. He's 26 years old, the son of one of the richest men in America. He could be anywhere else right now, safe, comfortable, far from this godforsaken stretch of ocean where men die screaming in the night. But he chose this, and in exactly 90 seconds, a 2,000-ton Japanese destroyer will emerge from the darkness at 40 knots, slice his boat in half, and turn this routine patrol into the most harrowing survival story of World War II. Ensign George Ross is the first to see it. Ship at 2 o'clock. Kennedy spins the wheel hard to starboard, his mind racing through the geometry of evasion. But something is wrong. The silhouette isn't moving like a PT boat. It's too big, too fast, and it's coming directly at them. Sound General Quarters? The words barely leave his mouth before the bow of the Japanese destroyer Amagiri materializes from the darkness like a mountain of steel. Kennedy's stomach drops. There's no time to accelerate, no time to turn, no time to do anything but watch as 2,000 tons of warship bears down on his 80-foot plywood boat at 40 miles per hour. The impact is catastrophic. The Amagiri's reinforced bow strikes PT-109 at a 30-degree angle, slicing through the mahogany hull like a katana through paper. The boat ruptures. 100-octane aviation gasoline, over 3,000 gallons of it, sprays across the deck and ignites. Kennedy is thrown 10 feet through the air, slamming onto the deck so hard that his already damaged back compresses with a crack he can feel in his teeth. For a moment, everything is fire. The night sky turns orange. The screams of his men pierce through the roar of flames. 2 of his crew, Harold Marney and Andrew Kirksey, vanish instantly. Marney was standing at the exact point of impact. His body is never found. Kirksey, thrown into the water, is swallowed by the burning gasoline. Kennedy pulls himself to his feet, choking on smoke and salt water, his skin blistering from the heat. Around him, the PT-109 is dying. The stern section has already gone under. The bow is following, tilting at an impossible angle as the Pacific rushes in. 11 men remain. They have no radio, no weapons, no supplies, no life rafts. They're floating in enemy-controlled waters, 4 miles from the nearest land, surrounded by Japanese bases on every island, and the night is just beginning. If you're watching this, I need you to do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. These stories take a lot of research to put together, and your support helps us keep making them. Now, let's get back to one of the most incredible survival stories in American history. To understand how Jack Kennedy ended up floating in the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by fire and death, we need to go back 3 months, to a decision that would shape not just his life, but the future of an entire nation. In May of 1943, Kennedy was stationed in the Solomon Islands, assigned to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2. He'd fought hard to get there. Literally fought. Against his own body, against his father's objections, against a military establishment that wanted nothing to do with a man whose medical file read like a catalog of chronic conditions. His back was the worst of it. A football injury at Harvard had left him with a degenerative disc condition that would eventually require multiple surgeries. The pain was constant, sometimes debilitating. Any reasonable doctor would have rejected him from military service immediately, but Kennedy was not interested in being reasonable. He used his father's political connections to get the medical requirements waived. Joseph Kennedy Sr., former ambassador to Great Britain, one of the most powerful men in American finance, made phone calls. Strings were pulled, examinations were overlooked. Jack Kennedy was going to war whether his body liked it or not. But why PT boats? Of all the assignments in the Navy, why choose the most dangerous, most uncomfortable, most likely to get you killed? The answer tells you everything you need to know about who Jack Kennedy was in 1943. PT boats were the cowboys of the Pacific War. Small, fast, expendable. They operated in waters where larger ships feared to go. Their crews were young, often barely out of their teens. Their missions were suicide runs dressed up as strategy. They darted into enemy harbors, launched torpedoes at ships 10 times their size, and then ran like hell into the darkness. The casualty rate was astronomical. In some squadrons, more than half the boats were lost in a single year. Kennedy wanted in. He trained at Melville, Rhode Island, where the Navy had established its PT boat school. He learned to navigate by stars in waters where charts were useless. He learned to fire torpedoes at moving targets in pitch darkness. He learned that PT boats were made of mahogany and plywood, materials chosen for speed, not survival. A direct hit from a Japanese shell wouldn't just damage a PT boat, it would vaporize it. By the time Kennedy arrived in the Solomon Islands, he understood exactly what he'd signed up for. The campaign there had been raging since August of 1942, when American Marines first landed on Guadalcanal. Now, almost a year later, the Japanese were desperately trying to hold the northern islands, while the Americans pushed up from the south. The key to everything was supply. Whoever could move more men and more material to the front lines would win. The Japanese had developed a system called the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyer runs down the slot, the central channel through the Solomon chain, delivering troops and supplies under cover of darkness. The PT boats were supposed to stop them. It wasn't going well. The boats were fast, yes, capable of over 40 knots in calm water, but their Mark 8 torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. The magnetic detonators failed more often than they worked. The gyroscopes malfunctioned in rough seas. A PT boat could make a perfect attack run, launch 4 torpedoes at a stationary target, and watch all 4 either miss or fail to explode. Kennedy learned this the hard way on his first combat missions. Night after night, his crew would spot Japanese barges or destroyers, make their attack runs, launch their torpedoes, and achieve absolutely nothing. The frustration was immense. They were risking their lives for weapons that didn't work. But what Kennedy didn't know, what none of the PT crews knew, was that the Japanese had developed something that would change everything. Hydrophones. These underwater listening devices could detect the distinctive rumble of PT boat engines from miles away. The Tokyo Express destroyers began adjusting their routes based on hydrophone intelligence, slipping past the American patrols like ghosts. Even worse, the Japanese had figured out that PT boats were essentially defenseless against a determined destroyer. Their torpedoes were unreliable, their guns were too small to penetrate destroyer armor, and their hulls were made of wood. A destroyer captain who spotted a PT boat didn't need to worry about getting hit. He just needed to run the smaller boat down. This was the trap that Kennedy was sailing into on the night of August 1st, 1943. The mission briefing that evening was straightforward. Intelligence had spotted a Tokyo Express run forming up at Rabaul, 4 destroyers carrying 900 soldiers and equipment for the garrison at Kolombangara. They would be coming down the slot sometime after midnight. 15 PT boats would spread out across Blackett Strait to intercept them. Kennedy gathered his crew in the fading tropical light. 12 men, most of them younger than he was. They had names that would later become famous, and faces that Kennedy would never forget. Patrick McMahon was the oldest at 37, a motor machinist mate from Detroit who had lied about his age to join the Navy at 17 and never looked back. He had a wife and daughter waiting for him back home, and he carried their photographs in a waterproof pouch that he never let out of his sight. McMahon was the kind of sailor who could diagnose an engine problem by the sound alone, who could nurse a damaged Packard back to life when anyone else would have given up. He was also Kennedy's closest friend on the boat. Barney Ross was the opposite. A fresh-faced ensign from Highland Park, Illinois, just 22 years old and barely out of Northwestern University. He had the eager, slightly nervous energy of a man who had volunteered for danger without fully understanding what danger meant. But he was smart, and he was brave, and Kennedy trusted him completely. Charles Harris came from Boston, Kennedy's hometown. He was a gunner's mate, responsible for the twin 50-caliber machine guns mounted on the forward deck. He had a thick Massachusetts accent and a wicked sense of humor that kept the crew laughing even in the worst situations. He and Kennedy had bonded over their shared love of the Red Sox and their shared hatred of the Yankees. Gerard Zinser, Raymond Albert, John McGuire, William Johnston, Raymond Starkey, Edgar Maurer, Leonard Tom, Harold Marney, Andrew Kirksey. Each man had a story, a family, a reason for being out here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, risking their lives. Kennedy looked at them now, these 12 men who had been entrusted to his care, and felt the full weight of command settle onto his shoulders. If something went wrong tonight, it would be his fault. Their lives were in his hands. Tonight might be the night, Kennedy told them, keeping his voice steady. We've got good intelligence, 4 destroyers, loaded down with troops. If we can get in close, if we can actually hit something for once, we could change the whole campaign. We could save hundreds of American lives. The men laughed, but there was nervousness underneath. They all knew what 4 destroyers meant. 4 destroyers meant 4 sets of deck guns, 4 sets of depth charges, 4 chances to get blown out of the water. What they didn't know was that command had already made a catastrophic mistake. The radio frequencies for the 15 PT boats hadn't been properly coordinated. Some boats were on one frequency, some on another, and some couldn't receive signals at all. When the destroyers appeared, there would be no way to coordinate an attack. Each boat would be on its own. Kennedy wouldn't find this out until it was far too late. At 9:30 p.m., PT-109 cast off from Rendova Harbor. The engines thundered to life. 3 Packard 4M 2500 supercharged V12s, each producing 1,500 horsepower, pushing the boat through the calm water at over 40 knots. At that speed, the hull barely touched the waves. They were flying. But as they entered Blackett Strait, Kennedy throttled back. Way back. The hydrophone threat was real, and the only way to avoid detection was to run on just one engine per side, idling so quietly that the sound might be mistaken for distant waves. The price of stealth was vulnerability. At idle speed, PT-109 could barely make 6 knots. If a destroyer spotted them, they would be helpless for the crucial seconds it took to spin up the other engines. Kennedy knew this. He made the call anyway. At 11:30 p.m., the first reports came crackling over the radio, those boats that could receive them anyway. The Tokyo Express had been spotted, 4 destroyers moving fast down the slot. They would be entering Blackett Strait within the hour. Kennedy ordered his men to battle stations. Gunner's mate Charles Harris manned the twin 50 caliber machine guns mounted forward. Torpedo man Raymond Starkey checked the 4 Mark 8 torpedoes in their tubes. Engineer Patrick McMahon climbed down into the engine room, where the heat from the idling Packards was already suffocating. And then they waited. The minutes crawled by. 11:45, midnight, 12:30. The darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars. Just the gentle slap of waves against the hull and the quiet mutter of idling engines. Kennedy scanned the horizon with binoculars, seeing nothing. The other PT boats were out there somewhere, but radio silence made coordination impossible. Each boat was an island, alone in the dark. At 1:30 a.m., a PT boat to the south, PT-162, spotted the destroyers and made an attack run. The flash of its torpedoes lit up the horizon for a brief moment. Kennedy saw it and tensed, waiting for the sound of explosions. None came. The torpedoes had missed, or malfunctioned, or both. The destroyers didn't even slow down. Another boat attacked. Then another. More flashes on the horizon. More torpedo launches. More failures. The Tokyo Express plowed through the ambush like it wasn't even there, delivering its cargo to Kolombangara without losing a single man. By 2 a.m., the destroyers should have been long gone, racing back up the slot toward Rabaul before dawn brought American aircraft. But Kennedy didn't know that. His radio was on the wrong frequency. He couldn't hear the reports from the other boats. As far as he knew, the destroyers were still coming, so he kept his position, kept idling, kept watching. At 2:27 a.m., Ensign Barney Ross was the first to see the shape in the darkness. Ship at 2 o'clock! Kennedy's heart hammered as he turned to look. There was something there, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving fast. His first thought was that it was another PT boat, one of the 15 scattered across the strait. Then the shadow grew larger, much larger. "The hell is that?" someone whispered. Kennedy didn't answer. He was already spinning the wheel hard to starboard, his hands moving to the throttles to bring up the other engines. But before he could push them forward, he realized with sick certainty what he was looking at. It wasn't a PT boat. It was the Amagiri, a Japanese destroyer that had made its delivery and was now racing back north at 40 knots. And it was coming straight at them. Kennedy had maybe 10 seconds to react. It wasn't enough. The collision happened at 2:27 a.m. in almost total darkness, and it was over in less than 2 seconds. The Amagiri's bow struck PT-109 just forward of the cockpit, cutting the boat in half with surgical precision. The forward section, about 40 feet of it, stayed afloat, buoyed by watertight compartments. The rest simply disappeared, dragged under by the weight of 3 engines and 1,000 pounds of ammunition. 2 men went with it. Harold Marney had been standing at the exact point of impact. He never had a chance. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, his body crushed between 2,000 tons of destroyer and the splintering hull of the PT boat. Andrew Kirksey was thrown into the water, directly into the path of the burning gasoline that erupted from the ruptured fuel tanks. He surfaced once, screaming, and then went under. His body would never be recovered. Kennedy himself was slammed against the cockpit so hard that his already damaged back absorbed an impact that would have crippled another man. For a moment, he thought he was dying. The pain was beyond anything he'd ever experienced. A white-hot lightning bolt that started in his spine and radiated through every nerve in his body. But he didn't die. And as the fire spread across the water around what remained of PT-109, he forced himself to his feet. "Report!" he shouted. "Who's still here?" Voices came out of the darkness, some strong, some weak, all of them terrified. Patrick McMahon had been in the engine room when the destroyer hit. The explosion had engulfed him in flames, burning his hands and arms so badly that the skin was already beginning to peel away. He was in the water, barely conscious, unable to swim. Charles Harris was clinging to the wreckage, unhurt, but in shock. Barney Ross was somewhere in the darkness, calling out. Others were surfacing one by one, coughing up seawater and gasoline, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 11 men. That was all that remained of the 13 who had cast off from Rendova Harbor just 5 hours earlier. Kennedy quickly took stock. The forward section of PT-109 was still floating, but it was inverted. The deck pointed down, the hull pointed up. It wouldn't last long. They had maybe a few hours before it sank completely. No radio, no weapons, no supplies. 4 miles from the nearest land, in the middle of enemy-controlled waters, with Japanese bases on Gizo, Kolombangara, and Vella Lavella surrounding them on all sides. And Patrick McMahon couldn't swim. Kennedy made his decision instantly. He wasn't going to let any more of his men die. Not on his watch. Not while he still had breath in his body. "Everyone, grab onto the hull," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos with a calm authority that surprised even himself. "We're going to wait until dawn, then swim for land. No one panics. No one gives up. We stay together, and we survive. Understood?" The men nodded, clinging to the wreckage as the fire slowly burned itself out on the water around them. The gasoline had spread across the surface, turning the Pacific into a lake of flame. But now the fuel was exhausted, and the darkness was returning. Kennedy took a mental inventory of his crew. McMahon was badly burned. He could hear the older man whimpering in pain somewhere in the darkness. Harris seemed unhurt. Ross was shaken but functional. Tom, the executive officer, had a gash on his forehead that was bleeding freely into the salt water. The others reported in one by one. Cuts, bruises, strained muscles. But everyone was alive. Everyone who had survived the initial collision was still breathing, for now. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. If they tried to swim now, in total darkness, they would almost certainly drown or become separated. If they waited, they at least had a chance. But as the hours crept by and the hull settled lower and lower in the water, Kennedy began to realize just how bad their situation really was. The Japanese destroyer hadn't stopped. It hadn't circled back to check for survivors. Yamagiri's captain probably didn't even know he'd hit anything. At 40 knots in total darkness, the impact would have been barely noticeable, like a car running over a pothole. No one was coming to rescue them. The other PT boats had scattered after the failed attack, racing back to Rendova to report. They would assume that PT-109 had been destroyed with all hands. There would be no search party. Kennedy and his men were on their own. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Kennedy gathered his men for a council of war. The situation was grim. They had no fresh water, no food. McMahon's burns were already beginning to fester in the warm, salty water. Several other men had injuries. Cuts, bruises, a possible broken rib. And 4 miles away, visible as a dark smudge against the lightening sky, was the nearest land, a tiny, uninhabited island called Plum Pudding Island. Kennedy studied it through salt-burned eyes. The swim would take hours. The current was against them. Japanese patrol boats might spot them at any moment, and McMahon couldn't swim a stroke. But staying on the wreckage wasn't an option. In a few more hours, it would sink. And even if it didn't, the Japanese would certainly find them when the sun came up. "We're going to swim for that island," Kennedy announced. "I'll tow McMahon. Everyone else, stay together." "Whoa." Barney Ross looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Skip. That's 4 miles in open water. With the current against us," Kennedy's jaw tightened. "Do you have a better idea?" Ross didn't. At 8 a.m., Kennedy gave the order, and 11 men slipped off the slowly sinking hull of PT-109 and began the longest swim of their lives. McMahon was in bad shape. The burns on his hands and arms had blistered and burst. The salt water was agony. He couldn't move his arms to swim, could barely keep his head above water. Kennedy took the strap of McMahon's life jacket between his teeth and began to swim, breaststroke, hour after hour, dragging another man behind him while his own damaged back screamed in protest with every stroke. The other men swam in a loose group, helping each other when they could. Charles Harris stayed close to the weaker swimmers. Barney Ross ranged ahead, checking their course. The Pacific current pushed against them constantly, trying to sweep them out to sea. By noon, they had covered perhaps 2 miles. They had at least 2 more to go. Kennedy's muscles were cramping. His back was a single, continuous knot of pain. The strap of McMahon's life jacket had rubbed his mouth raw, but he kept swimming. One stroke, then another, then another. "You don't have to do this, Skipper," McMahon mumbled at one point. "Just leave me. I'm done anyway." Kennedy spat out salt water and kept swimming. "Shut up, Mac. I'm not losing any more men today." It took them 4 hours to cover the 4 miles to Plum Pudding Island. 4 hours of swimming against the current, fighting exhaustion, fighting pain, fighting the Pacific Ocean itself. When Kennedy finally felt sand under his feet, he collapsed. For several minutes, he couldn't move. The pain in his back was so intense that he thought he might never walk again. His arms hung useless at his sides, the muscles completely spent. He had just swum 4 miles while towing another man behind him, and his body had finally reached its absolute limit. But they had made it. All 11 survivors had made it. Plum Pudding Island was barely an acre of sand and coconut palms, too small to support life for long. There was no fresh water, no food except for a few green coconuts, no shelter from the tropical sun. But it was land, and for the moment, that was enough. Kennedy allowed his men 2 hours to rest. Then he gathered them together. "We're not staying here," he said. "There's nothing to eat, nothing to drink. We need to get to a bigger island, somewhere with water and maybe some supplies." Barney Ross groaned. "Skip, we just swam 4 miles. The men are exhausted." "I know." Kennedy's voice was quiet but firm. "But if we stay here, we die. Simple as that." He laid out the plan. There was a larger island about 2 miles to the southeast, Olasana Island. It had trees, which meant shade. It might have coconuts. And more importantly, it was closer to Ferguson Passage, the channel that PT boats used for their nightly patrols. If Kennedy could get to Ferguson Passage, he might be able to signal a passing boat. That evening, as the sun began to set, Kennedy made a decision that would push his already battered body beyond all reasonable limits. "I'm going to swim out to Ferguson Passage tonight," he announced. "I'll take a lantern. If I see a PT boat, I'll signal them." His men stared at him in disbelief. "Skipper, that's suicide," Harris said. "Ferguson Passage is at least 3 miles from here, in the dark, with strong currents." Kennedy shook his head. "I've swum that far before. I can do it again." He didn't mention that he'd never swum that far in the dark, in enemy-controlled waters, with a current that could sweep him out to sea. He didn't mention that his back was still spasming, that his arms felt like lead, that he'd eaten nothing except a few bites of coconut in the last 18 hours. He just stripped off his shirt, grabbed the battle lantern, and waded into the water. The swim to Ferguson Passage was the loneliest experience of Kennedy's life. The darkness was absolute. He couldn't see the island behind him, couldn't see the passage ahead. The only way he could tell which way was north was by watching the stars when they occasionally appeared through breaks in the clouds. The current was worse than he'd anticipated. It wasn't pushing him in any single direction. It was swirling, eddying, first pulling him left, then right, then spinning him around entirely. Several times, he had to stop and get his bearings, treading water while he looked for familiar stars. Halfway to the passage, his cramps returned with a vengeance. His right leg seized up so badly that he couldn't kick. For a terrible moment, he thought he was going to drown, not from enemy action, not from exhaustion, but from a simple muscle cramp. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Kennedy gritted his teeth and kept swimming. One arm, then the other. Let the leg trail behind. Just keep moving. When he finally reached Ferguson Passage, the disappointment was crushing. No PT boats, nothing but empty water, reflecting the faint starlight. He floated there for over an hour, holding the battle lantern above his head, hoping against hope that an American patrol would appear. None did. The swim back was even worse. Exhaustion was settling into his bones now, the deep fatigue that comes before complete physical breakdown. Several times, Kennedy lost consciousness while swimming, his body continuing on autopilot while his mind simply shut down. When he finally staggered back onto Plum Pudding Island, the sun was already coming up. He had been in the water for over 9 hours. His men rushed to help him, dragging him up onto the beach. Kennedy couldn't speak, could barely move. He'd pushed his body past every limit it had, and now it was simply refusing to function. But he'd survived. And as long as he was still breathing, he wasn't going to give up. The next morning, Kennedy gathered his strength for another desperate gamble. They would move to Olasana Island. 2 miles of swimming, this time during daylight, when they could see where they were going. It was risky, but staying on Plum Pudding meant certain death. The swim was brutal, but uneventful. By mid-afternoon, all 11 survivors had reached Olasana. The island was larger, with more trees and more coconuts. There was even a small freshwater spring, barely a trickle, but enough to keep them alive. Kennedy allowed himself one night of rest, just one. Then on the morning of August 5th, he and Barney Ross swam to yet another island, Nauru Island, at the edge of Ferguson Passage. They were hoping to find supplies, maybe a boat, something that could help them escape. What they found was better than they could have imagined. Nauru Island had been the site of a Japanese camp, abandoned months earlier. The Japanese had left behind supplies, hard candy, a 50-gallon drum of fresh water, and, most importantly, a small 2-man canoe. Kennedy and Ross loaded what they could carry into the canoe and began paddling back to Olasana. The sun was setting, turning the western sky into a blaze of orange and pink, and that's when they saw them. 2 figures, standing on the beach of Olasana. Kennedy's heart froze. Japanese soldiers? Had the enemy found his men? Were the survivors of PT-109 already dead? He and Ross paddled closer, keeping low in the canoe. As they approached, Kennedy could see that the figures weren't wearing Japanese uniforms. They were islanders, Melanesian scouts who worked for the Allied Coast Watcher Network. Their names were Byuku Gasa and Ironi Kumana, and they would become the heroes of this story. Byuku and Ironi had been paddling their own canoe through the islands, looking for evidence of the PT boat that had been reported missing. When they found the survivors on Olasana, they immediately understood the situation. But there was a problem. The scouts spoke almost no English. Kennedy spoke no Melanesian. How could they communicate? Kennedy's mind raced. He needed to send a message to the American base at Rendova, 40 miles away. But he had no paper, no pen, nothing to write with. Then his eyes fell on a coconut. Kennedy picked up the coconut and pulled out his pocket knife. Carefully, letter by letter, he carved a message into the shell. Noro ISL, Commander, native knows posit. He can pilot. 11. Alive, need small boat. Kennedy. 11 letters. The most important 11 letters of his life. He handed the coconut to Byuku, pointed toward the southeast, and made paddling motions. The scout nodded, understanding. He took the coconut, climbed into his canoe, and began the 40-mile journey to Rendova. It would take him almost 2 full days. During those 48 hours, Kennedy and his men waited. They had water now and some food, but they were still stranded behind enemy lines. Japanese patrol boats passed close to the island several times. Each time the survivors hid in the jungle, barely breathing, praying that they wouldn't be discovered. The waiting was almost worse than the swimming. At least when Kennedy was in the water, he was doing something, taking action, moving toward a goal. Now all he could do was sit and hope that a carved coconut and a Melanesian scout would somehow reach the American lines. On the evening of August 7th, 6 days after the collision, Kennedy was sitting on the beach of Olasana when he saw a canoe approaching from the southeast. His heart pounded. Was it Byuku returning with help, or was it a Japanese patrol? As the canoe drew closer, Kennedy could see that it contained several figures, too many to be scouts. He tensed, preparing to run. Then one of the figures stood up and called out in accented English, "I have a letter for you." The letter was from Lieutenant Arthur Reginald Evans, an Australian coast watcher stationed on Kolomangara. Byuku had delivered the coconut message to Rendova, and the Navy had immediately dispatched Evans to coordinate a rescue. The letter contained specific instructions. Kennedy and his men were to paddle to a specific point on Olasana Island at 10:01 p.m. A PT boat would be waiting to pick them up. Kennedy's hands trembled as he read the words. After 6 days of swimming, hiding, and hoping, rescue was finally coming. That night, the survivors of PT-109 gathered on the designated beach. The sky was dark, no moon, no stars, just like the night of the collision. But this time, the darkness was their friend. At exactly 10 p.m., the rumble of Packard engines emerged from the silence. A PT boat, PT-157, commanded by Lieutenant Henry Brantingham, materialized out of the night, its engines throttled down to a whisper. Kennedy waded out to meet it. As he climbed aboard, Lieutenant Brantingham extended his hand. "Kennedy, we thought you were dead." Kennedy shook his head slowly. "Not yet." One by one, the 11 survivors of PT-109 climbed aboard PT-157. Patrick McMahon had to be lifted. His burns were so severe that he couldn't grip the ladder. Charles Harris and Barney Ross helped the other injured men. Within minutes, everyone was aboard. As the PT boat turned and accelerated toward Rendova, Kennedy took one last look at the islands that had been his home for 6 days. Plum Pudding Island, Olasana, Nauru. Tiny specks of sand in an endless ocean where 13 men had faced death and 11 had survived. He never forgot them. Decades later, as President of the United States, he kept that carved coconut on his desk in the Oval Office. The rescue of the PT-109 survivors made Kennedy a national hero. The story was reported in newspapers across America. The young lieutenant who had towed a burned man for 4 miles, who had swum through shark-infested waters to signal for help, who had refused to give up even when all hope seemed lost. Kennedy downplayed his own role. "It was involuntary," he said when asked about his heroism. "They sank my boat." But the men who survived knew better. Patrick McMahon, whose life Kennedy had saved during that 4-mile swim, would later say, "He was the reason we made it, not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he refused to quit. And as long as he didn't quit, the rest of us couldn't either." Kennedy received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his actions, along with the Purple Heart for the injuries he sustained in the collision. The citation praised his courage, endurance, and excellent leadership. But the real story of PT-109 wasn't about medals or heroism. It was about what happens when ordinary men are pushed to extraordinary limits. 13 young Americans went out on a routine patrol in August of 1943. 2 of them never came back. But the other 11 survived because one man, a 26-year-old lieutenant with a bad back and a stubborn streak, refused to accept that they were going to die. That same stubbornness would carry John F. Kennedy through the rest of his life, through chronic pain that never fully went away, through a political career that took him from the House of Representatives to the Senate to the White House, through 13 days in October of 1962, when the fate of the world hung in the balance during the Cuban Missile Crisis. People who knew Kennedy often wondered where his famous coolness under pressure came from. His ability to stay calm when everyone around him was panicking, his refusal to make hasty decisions, even when every instinct screamed for immediate action, his uncanny ability to see clearly in moments of crisis, to cut through the noise and focus on what really mattered. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba brought the world closer to Armageddon than it had ever been, Kennedy's advisors were split. Some wanted immediate military action, an airstrike, an invasion, something decisive. Others counseled caution, negotiation, patience. Kennedy listened to both sides. He asked questions. He examined the evidence. And then, after 13 days of the most intense pressure any president had ever faced, he made his decision. He would impose a naval blockade on Cuba and negotiate directly with Soviet Premier Khrushchev. No invasion, no airstrike, no World War III. His critics called it weakness. His supporters called it wisdom. But everyone agreed that Kennedy had remained remarkably calm throughout the entire crisis. Calm in a way that seemed almost supernatural, as if he had faced death before and learned that panic never helped. He had faced death before, in the waters of Blackett Strait, on a burning PT boat surrounded by Japanese destroyers. He had learned exactly what happened when you let fear take over. And he had learned what was possible when you refused to give in. The answer, perhaps, was floating in the Pacific Ocean on the night of August 2nd, 1943, when a Japanese destroyer materialized out of the darkness and gave Kennedy exactly 10 seconds to react. And those 10 seconds stretched into 6 days of survival against impossible odds. After that, everything else was easy. Bukugasa and Eroni Kumana, the scouts who carried the coconut message to Rendova, were honored by both the American and British governments for their role in the rescue. Both men lived long lives in the Solomon Islands, and both were visited by Kennedy during his presidency. At the dedication of the PT-109 Memorial in the Solomons in 2002, Bukugasa, then 80 years old, finally received formal recognition for his heroism. He died in 2005, a national hero in his own country. The coconut itself became one of the most famous artifacts of World War II. After the war, Kennedy had it encased in plastic and kept it on his desk throughout his political career. It sat in the Oval Office during the Bay of Pigs invasion, during the Berlin crisis, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a constant reminder of the worst night of his life, and of what was possible when a man refused to give up. Harold Marney and Andrew Kirksey, the 2 crewmen who died in the collision, were posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. Marney's body was never recovered. He is memorialized at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines, alongside thousands of other Americans who gave their lives in the Pacific War. Kirksey's remains were recovered months later and are buried in Mississippi, his home state. The Yamagiri, the Japanese destroyer that rammed PT-109, survived the war, but was sunk in 1944 by an American mine in the Makassar Strait. Its captain, Kohei Hanami, was unaware that he had nearly killed a future American president until years after the war. When he learned the truth, he expressed regret, but also pointed out that in war, such things happen. He was right. They do. PT boats continued to operate in the Solomon Islands until the campaign ended in late 1943. Their record remained mixed. The Mark 8 torpedoes never became reliable, and the boats were eventually phased out in favor of more effective weapons. But the men who served on them were never forgotten. They had faced impossible odds with wooden boats and faulty torpedoes, and many of them had died doing it. Kennedy left the Navy in 1945, his back so damaged that he could barely walk without assistance. He would spend the rest of his life in chronic pain, dependent on medication and back braces just to function. But he never complained, and he never let it stop him. In 1960, 17 years after PT-109, Kennedy was elected the 35th President of the United States. He was the youngest man ever elected to that office, and he brought with him a generation of Americans who had served in World War II, men who had faced death in the Pacific and in Europe, who had learned what they were capable of when everything seemed lost. Kennedy's presidency lasted only 1,000 days. On November 22, 1963, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He was 46 years old, but the story of PT-109 outlived him. It became a symbol of American resilience, of leadership under pressure, of the extraordinary things ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to give up. The PT-109 Memorial stands today in the Solomon Islands, on the spot where Kennedy and his crew first reached land after their 4-mile swim. Tourists visit it from around the world, standing on the same beach where 11 exhausted men collapsed after swimming for 4 hours against the current. The carved coconut is still on display at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston. Visitors can see the letters Kennedy carved with his pocket knife. Noro, ISL, Commander, Native knows posset. The desperate message that saved 11 lives. And somewhere in the waters of Blackett Strait, in the darkness where PT-109 went down, the bones of Harold Marney still rest. A young American who died at 20 years old in a war that changed the world, serving on a boat commanded by a man who would one day lead a nation. This is the story of PT-109. A story of courage, endurance, and the refusal to accept defeat. A story of a young lieutenant who dragged a burned man through 4 miles of ocean, who swam 9 hours through the darkness searching for rescue, who carved a message on a coconut and trusted 2 strangers to carry it to safety. It's a story about leadership. Not the kind you learn in textbooks, but the kind that emerges when everything goes wrong and you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be. John F. Kennedy decided to be the kind of person who doesn't leave his men behind, who keeps swimming when his muscles are cramping and his back is screaming, who looks at impossible odds and says, "We're not dying today." That decision, made in the waters of Blackett Strait in August of 1943, shaped everything that came after. It made Kennedy a hero, then a congressman, then a senator, then a president. It shaped how he handled crises, how he led his country, how he faced his own mortality. And it all started with a collision in the dark, a sinking boat, and a young man who refused to give up. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to see more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. And remember what Kennedy learned in the waters of the Pacific. No matter how bad things get, as long as you're still breathing, you haven't lost yet. Until next time.